So Shaon Lahiri over here, postdoctoral researcher, University of Pennsylvania. And I figured why not show a video of one of my papers. So I'm going to talk to you today about social norms change in tobacco use. I'm going to present results from a systematic review and meta-analysis that I did. Of course, I recorded a video, so let us see if you can hear the video. So if you cannot hear the video, Daniel, please unmute and let me know.
Thanks for that introduction, Shaon. Hi, everyone. I'm here to talk to you today about social norms change in tobacco use. And this is work done jointly with colleagues from the George Washington University, the University of Iowa, and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Now, let's get started. As you know, tobacco use is a major problem all over the world. About 8 million people die every year from tobacco-related illnesses, and about 80% of that mortality is concentrated in low and middle-income countries. We know taxes and laws are the most effective approaches to changing tobacco use. But what do you do when you're in countries with relatively weaker tobacco control policy environments and when you want to reach hardened smokers? So there we have to also target the social dimensions of tobacco use, and key among these dimensions are social norms. Now we know that social norms matter for tobacco initiation, for sustained use, but are the interventions based on social norms to change tobacco use effective? Well, to answer this, we just gotta synthesize the evidence from social norms interventions, which is very difficult, because social norms are defined in varied ways. There's over 100 years of published scholarship on the subject. So where do we begin? Well, I chose to begin with focusing on the active ingredients underlying these social norms interventions, called social norms mechanisms. Legros and Szilagyi identified 5 of them: correction of misperceptions, structural changes, legal reforms, role models or influential individuals, and then power dynamics. So thought that was pretty useful. And then I wanted to understand, okay, what do we know? Are these interventions effective? If so, how effective are they? And do they use any of these social norms change mechanisms? And if so, which ones are most commonly used? Now, what is a social norms change intervention? Basically a coordinated set of activities designed to change, in this case, tobacco use outcomes that either employ an identified social norms change mechanism, or they measure social norms resulting from an intervention, or they mention social norms in the design of the intervention. So I kept it deliberately broad to really see what's out there, but I only wanted to focus on quasi-experimental and experimental studies to get at some estimate of causal effects. So I excluded any studies that didn't do any of these things, basically. Now, I found about 3,000 records, distilled those to about 88 studies, included in a narrative synthesis of results, and then I performed a tobacco outcomes meta-analysis using 186 effect sizes from 79 studies, and then a social norms meta-analysis for 64 effect sizes from 27 studies. Now keep in mind, individual studies can have multiple effect sizes if they have multiple treatment groups, for example, if they have multiple outcomes. So I made sure to use a model specification that accounts for this effect size dependency in meta-analyses. And I will say that the tobacco meta-analysis covered about 147,000 people, and the social norms meta-analysis covered about 67,000. Unsurprisingly, most of the evidence was concentrated in the US and Europe, relatively little in Asia, and nothing in Africa and Latin America. Most of the studies were randomized controlled trials, they were school-based programs, and they were relatively long on average, just under a year. And among the studies that measured social norms, friends were the most common reference group. And among the social norms change mechanisms, I found that there was a mechanism that was not identified by Legros and Szilagyi that emerged as the most common approach, which I call resistance skills training. And then in terms of the narrative results, like I said, most of the interventions were school-based. They used education approaches involving usually multiple social norms change mechanisms. And then beyond the classroom, there was a lot of counseling-based approaches, sometimes with medication, and most studies actually didn't even measure social norms, despite mentioning norms as helping design their intervention. Now, in terms of the meta-analysis, we can broadly conclude that on average, they seem to work. These interventions seem to work for changing tobacco use outcomes as well as social norms outcomes. So this is on standard deviation units, so about 0.23 of a standard deviation on average for tobacco outcomes and 0.28 for social norms outcomes. Now keep in mind, this is just an average, so it masks a great deal of heterogeneity. So if you break it down by study type, most of the effects are driven by quasi-experimental studies, which have less controlled conditions than RCTs, of course, but the RCTs still had a small but significant effect size on average. Now, when I explored the heterogeneity even more with some meta-regression techniques using the mechanisms as covariates, I found that role models really was one of the most common and most effective approaches, but resistance skills training was significant, smaller than role models, but still significant. But it had like the most precision because there was 100 effect sizes there coming from 37 studies. And then the length of the intervention didn't really make any difference. There was no significant effect there for the length of the intervention. So to wrap up my discussion, social norms interventions are effective for changing both norms around tobacco use and actual tobacco use. And we have massive geographical gaps in our evidence. So we need to really scale up and do work in settings where we don't have as much evidence. And also, resistance skills training seems to be a new mechanism that we should add to the list by Legros and Szilagyi, and it's related to something called social inoculation, which was quite common in the 80s. And I'll just wrap up by saying social norms interventions are extremely diverse, and focusing on these underlying change mechanisms can help bring us consistency to the field and inform our interventions and policies and programs. Thank you all for listening. You know who I am. I'm the guy talking right now. And email me if you ever want to talk norms and behavior change. Thanks very much and have a great talk.
All right, thank you very much to me.